Hello, everyone. We are just going to wait a few minutes, give people some time to log in, get connected, and then we'll have a little chat. I'm going to apologize right now, as everyone is just getting in, that I am fighting off a cold at the moment, and so I will probably be coughing and sneezing and gagging kind of throughout, but we will soldier on. And the best thing about Facebook Live is that you have no worries about catching the cold that I have as we connect via the internet instead of face to face, where I could spread whatever was spread to me last week. While we are talking, though, by all means, please feel free to ask any questions. I will be watching the chat bar as it's going. So if you do have questions, throw it out there, and I will be happy to answer as we have a little conversation today. Okay, so I think we are probably good to get started. So welcome to everybody who has logged in today. Welcome to everyone in the future that is watching this down the line in an archived format. I really appreciate everybody taking the time to hear me talk a little bit today about disability, about some of my research, and to think a little bit differently about the ways in which we create, construct, and imagine the world which we live. So who am I? My name is Dr. Jeff Preston. I'm an assistant professor at King's University College, which is an affiliate of Western University. We're on the other side of Richmond Street, if you know Western Campus well. What do I do at King's? So I teach a variety of courses in our disability studies field. I teach a first year class, which is an introduction to the field of disability studies. But much of my research and my teaching tends to fall into the world of culture. My PhD is in media studies. So I'm very interested in the ways in which we talk about, think about, and tell stories about disability, and the ways in which that helps us to understand how we think and feel about disability. And as you'll find out today, I have some really strong opinions about that and how we might not be doing things in the best way possible. So now, before I get started, I want to have a huge thank you to NFF for having me on today, for letting me carry on this conversation. You'll notice in the chat as well on the Facebook page, there's some amazing links to resources. You'll see some of them posted there on your sidebar, as well under the About page, or if you go straight to the Neighbors, Friends, and Families website, neighborsfriendsandfamilies.ca, there are tons of resources that you're able to get connected into. I will also say that myself personally, I'm very easy to find on the internet, and I am very happy to be found on the internet. So if you have questions or comments, or if 10 years down the line, you're like, I remember that thing I saw on the internet once. I have a question now. By all means, find me, send me a message. I'm very happy to talk to you. So what are we going to talk about today? Today, I want to talk a little bit about the ways in which we think about disability, and more specifically, the ways in which we believe that there are two kinds of people in this world: disabled people and non-disabled people. Something that I don't think is maybe the most accurate. Now, to understand what my story is and to understand where my research perspectives come from, I think I need to share a little bit about myself with you. And so for that, I want to take us back in time to the summer of 1983. That was the summer when I was born. And it didn't take long for my parents to realize that something wasn't quite right. I wasn't reacting to the world in the same way as my older sister was when she was a baby. They figured out something was wrong. My dad has told me stories about how he realized very early on that if he put me down on the couch, I wouldn't really move around. I would just kind of stay planted wherever I was. And that they figured was not normal. Like my sister was always crawling around, getting into things. And so they took me to the doctor. And after doing some tests, eventually they would make an incision on my right bicep. They would take a little bit of muscle, and under research with a microscope and other technology, it was determined that I have what is called muscular dystrophy. Now, muscular dystrophy is a genetic disorder that affects the growth of muscle, meaning that I don't produce muscle in the same way as other people. So I'm very weak in all of my limbs, which is what a doctor would call a quadriplegic, as in quad, as in all four limbs, as opposed to a paraplegic, which is only para, two limbs. Anyways, it was at this moment that my parents were sat down and they were told in no uncertain terms that their son would be different. They were told that their son would never walk. They were told that their son would probably struggle in school. They were told that their son would likely never get a job, that their son would likely never move out of home, that he would probably not go to college or university, that he would be dependent on them forever because he has a disability. Now, for reasons that I don't necessarily fully understand or comprehend, my parents didn't necessarily agree with that assessment. That they didn't understand why the doctors were saying that things that seemed very focused on lots of different types of skills and abilities, I would be barred from because I was missing one ability, specifically the ability to walk. And so my parents brought me up with a bit of a different perspective that yes, I would have things that I could not do, but that in some ways, that's actually not very different from many people in this world. That in fact, if we look around, many of us have limitations. Many of us have things that we're maybe not as good at as other people. And so perhaps instead of worrying so much about that which I could not do, instead we needed to think about how can we be creative in finding ways for me to be able to do things. So I remember when I was a young child, I was a child of the early 90s. And so I remember a time when the Toronto Blue Jays were not a terrible garbage team that lost all the time. In fact, they were world champions twice in a row, in fact. And so I loved baseball and I really wanted to play. But there's, of course, some barriers to being able to play baseball when you are using a manual wheelchair and you're not very strong. But that didn't stop my parents from wanting to find a way for me to be able to participate. And so what we did was we started to figure out ways in which we could change the rules, adapt the sport to take my limitations out of the equation and to provide me an opportunity to be an effective and useful player on the team. And so I started using a lighter bat, a bat that was made out of sort of foam and plastic instead of a big heavy aluminum bat. When I would hit the ball, I would have an assigned runner who would run the bases for me instead. I would play in the outfield instead of the infield, and I would use the lacrosse stick so I could pick the ball up off the ground without being able to reach the ground, and I could use the leverage of the stick to be able to throw the ball in. And lo and behold, I was able to play baseball that wasn't just for other disabled people. I could be included with some pretty simple changes. At the same time, I grew up fully understanding that I was different. I knew that I wasn't the same as the other students, as I was the only person in my class who used first a manual wheelchair, and then eventually when I was in grade 4, an electric wheelchair. But that wasn't the only reason I knew I was different. I knew I was different largely because of the way in which people interacted with me. I realized very early on that people would constantly come up to me and ask, "Oh, what happened? Why are you in a wheelchair?" Which is actually a really difficult question to answer when you have a genetic disorder, because of course, if there was like a big accident or a tragedy, that might be a cool story to tell. But my story was essentially that I was born, and that's kind of it. So of course, I've had fun with it. I've liked to make up little joke stories about maybe what happened and watch people's amazement and then say, no, it just happened. I also realized early on that people had these ideas that I would be in some way ashamed or upset or sad about my situation, that I was experiencing a personal tragedy. which is really different than how I perceived myself. People would come up to me and say things like, "It's so good to see you out," just when I'm walking on the sidewalk, or tell me that I'm an inspiration when I'm at a bar on a Friday night. Kind of a weird thing to hear, for sure. And so I began to ask myself academically, as I started moving into my graduate work, what is it that causes people to think about disability inevitably as a bad thing, as a tragedy, as something that's rooted on inability, as opposed to seeing people as just that, people. People who maybe operate or function or interact slightly differently, but at the end of the day are just people. Now, to answer that question, when we look into the field of disability studies, that answer comes to us in the ways in which we model disability. So the field of disability studies has long argued that the way that we perceive disability, the ways in which we understand it, are informed by what's called the individual model of disability, sometimes referred to as the medical model of disability. So what is the medical model of disability? The medical model states that disability is found inherently within the individual. I am Jeff Preston. I have a disability. It is mine. I am the one who is different, and therefore I am the one who is responsible for fixing my problem. My problem is that my body functions differently than the normal. And so we then say, if the problem is in the individual, it's their responsibility to try and find a solution, that they will need special ramps, they will need special accommodations, they will need special treatment in order to fix their special need. But in about the 1970s, and you'll hear more about this in one of the videos that is shared in the resources, there was a group of people in the United Kingdom, in Britain, who started to think a little differently about disability. They started to ask themselves, well, if the world was fully wheelchair accessible, would you still be disabled if you used a wheelchair? To put this a different way, the question becomes, am I disabled because I have muscular dystrophy? Or am I actually disabled by the fact that our world is designed and built with the expectation of a normal functioning human body, meaning someone with 2 working arms, 2 working legs, 2 working eyes and ears, a mouth, a brain, that all function in the exact same way. The reality, of course, is that that doesn't really define anyone in our world. That if we start to line people up, whether it's comparatively with genetics and DNA, whether it's through functional tests, gait analysis, performance in physical tasks and intellectual tasks, cognitive tasks, everyone actually does kind of function a little bit differently. Some have different strengths, some have different weaknesses. What that means then is that we are fundamentally building a disabling world based on what we call the ableist assumption of normalcy. The idea that the normal is not just the preferred, but also is the most obvious, most common, most expected. This is what we call the societal model of disability. To say, instead of worrying about trying to fix people, instead, perhaps what we need to start to think about is how we fix environments. Now, what does that look like, or how might that be interpreted? I want to give you guys an interesting example. I am a university professor, and I'm hoping that there are some people watching today who are in some way affiliated with or associated with the schooling system, whether you're a student yourself, or maybe you're a teacher or an EA. I hope that's the case. Welcome, if that's true. If not, that's okay. There's plenty of time for you to change your life and get into the teaching field. It's a great place to be. Jokes aside, here's an example of the ways in which the environment, and I'm not just talking building environment, but the world in which we exist, how that can disable people. And for this example, I want to talk about education. So when I was just a little guy, I was a little kid, I was falling behind in math. I was really bad at math for lots of reasons. I was just not a math person. As you can imagine, I'm now in the liberal arts college where I don't have to worry about math so much. But I was really bad at math. And a teacher realized what part of the problem was for me. Part of the problem with muscular dystrophy is that I don't have a lot of strength in my hands or my arms, and I get tired really easily. And she realized that as I was writing over and over and over again, equation after equation after equation, that in doing my math homework, it was taking me a very long time. And a lot of that was spent writing things that weren't actually connected to the learning experience. So I was writing 1 + 1 = 2, 2 + 2 = 4, 4 + 4 = 8. The question then became, why do we require students to write the equation over and over and over again when what we're really testing is their ability to do the equation? The answer is actually what matters more than the equation itself. So the teacher had a really interesting, intuitive, simple solution. She decided that instead of writing the equations, I would be given photocopies of the math textbook, where I would then be able to just simply write in the answer, as opposed to having to write all of the mechanical pieces of the math equation. By changing the environment, we were able to reduce some of the impairment impacts to allow me to be able to perform comparative to my classmates. Now, this starts to enter into a bigger, broader conversation. Should this be an accommodation that's only offered to me? Or is this something that could benefit lots of other different types of students? This leads me into part of what my research is right now at the college, which is thinking about how we build classrooms and the ways in which we put restrictions and barriers around the ways in which we teach and allow access to information and knowledge by students based upon not good pedagogical reasons, but generally based upon things like, well, that's how I did it when I was in school. So we need to start to think a little differently about not just education, but the world itself, the ways in which we form, construct, and build the world. We need to think about how we can focus on where we want people to arrive and less about how they get there. Think about my wheelchair, my electric wheelchair. Does it really matter if I walk out of this room today or if I drive my electric wheelchair? Do either have more value than the other? Think about the ways in which we ourselves every day put up obstacles, barriers, limitations that prevent people from being included simply because we build a world based on our preferences, our needs, without the thought of the diversity of human ability. So I think what disability studies is asking us to consider is not necessarily the idea that everyone has a disability of some variety, but rather to think differently about the human itself, to question normalcy, to question whether or not normal is actually a real thing, to question about where we place the burden of change. Do we need to change people, or do we need to change systems, policies, buildings, environments? Is that perhaps a faster and more equitable way forward? Because at the end of the day, medical science is fundamentally limited. It will not be able to cure everything. So rather than trying to fix the bodies and the minds of people, perhaps we also need to spend time fixing the world around us. I don't think the story of disability is actually the story of 20% of our population, but rather, I think disability is actually the story of humanity. I think disability is the story of how all of our bodies are fragile and vulnerable, are in a constant state of flux, of ability and inability, bound together by the fact that all of us fall into disrepair. And the idea that our bodies are fine, even if they're different, that different bodies are not just okay bodies, but also can be desirable bodies, pleasant bodies, functional bodies. I think we need to realize that disabled bodies might be seen as aberrant, as not normal, but rather normalcy is a myth. That disabled people are, I think, proof that it's not just okay to be different, but that you can be valuable, can be productive, can be happy, even if you are different. So I encourage all of you to think about the ways, not just how the world is inaccessible, but I want you to question the ways in which your efforts, your thoughts, your perspectives are also contributing to the inaccessibility of our world. I want you to think about the ways in which your perception of the normal, your desire for the normal, may be limiting the number of people that you see as we versus they. So I hope this has been at least an entertaining, if not interesting, short little conversation. My little bit that I will leave you with, because I like to leave you with questions, some things that I'd like you to consider is, number one, I want you to think about, do you consider yourself a disabled person? Do you consider yourself to have a disability? Why and why not? What is that idea rooted in or based upon? Another example I want to give you, a question that I want you to think about, comes to us from the ever-contentious straw debate. We're trying to ban plastic straws for, as we say, the environment. But there are a lot of people with physical disabilities who require plastic straws in order to be able to drink. And there are lots of different ways in which we try to intervene in this problem. We will say people should bring their own plastic straws or use an alternative of some variety, even if those alternatives maybe don't work. So if we have our two models of disability, the individual model, which sees it as a personal problem, the societal model, which sees it as a societal problem, how would these two models address the question of plastic straws a little differently? That should keep you up for at least a few hours tonight as you're laying in bed, trying to sleep, trying to dream. And I hope that those dreams are not of a normal world, but rather of a world based on disability and our shared humanity. So thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out either on Twitter, via email, and make sure, as I said, you check out some of the great resources on the Neighbors, Friends, and Families website. Thank you, and have a lovely, wonderful afternoon.